If I speak too quickly, please let me know, because I tend to speak very quickly. That bio was very impressive. I always want to meet that person because I never feel like that person. Anyways, welcome, and thank you for letting me have the privilege of visiting and chatting with you today. I'm just going to show you my first picture there. It's often to me when I look at this picture, this is what it feels like to have a chronic illness, because sometimes it can feel very lonely and very rocky, and it's like, what do I do with what I have and who am I in the process? I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me, not so much about my skills and all my expertise or my lack thereof, but my story about having a chronic illness. I don't have lupus. I have a double pars defect, I have fibromyalgia, and I live with chronic pain. So this is my backstory going 30 years, and it's probably why I have an intense interest in this area, and why this is one of my sort of favorite areas to work with clients, and why I'm willing to spend so much time in some of the volunteer work I do, because I think it's very worthwhile. I think we're very worthwhile, and this is such a real part of what we deal with, whatever the chronic illness happens to be. So even for me, when I had symptoms without a diagnosis, just learning what I had, the process of learning what I had was so emotionally agonizing. And literally one day I was doing something and the next day my life stopped. And it went on for a long time. And the one thing I've learned to do is be a very, very good self-manager. And we're going to just sort of talk about the idea that we go through crisis when things happen. We go through stagnation as we're trying to find ways to deal with it. And then we have to start to understand all about ourselves and who we are with the chronic illness. And then we have to build our lives and move forward knowing that we have to be flexible, because what today is, what tomorrow is, may not be the same thing. Oh, hello. And so maintenance and then sort of managing and moving forward, right? In some ways, I like this picture better. This is a picture I actually took. This is not off the internet. This is my picture. It's from Vancouver Island, where my daughter happens to live, on the north end of Vancouver Island, where even in the most bizarre places, amazing things can happen. I love to look at this picture whenever I'm feeling kind of yuck about having a chronic illness myself. Just the fact that that tree can grow in a place where it shouldn't be, I guess that's what I like to think is possible with having a chronic illness, right? So, who has a chronic illness? This is what you might think of. The person in the wheelchair or whatever, right? Like, this is the picture you think of. This is actually the reality. It can be anybody. Anybody from someone who's very young, who's quite a bit older, and you often can't tell. These are the invisible disabilities, and that's what most chronic illnesses are. This is just some examples, and I know this is going to sound really interesting. I didn't put lupus at the front just because of this presentation. This slide comes out of a previous presentation. There are so many things that come under this category, and I won't worry about you reading them all, but mental illness, technically, from a medical perspective, also comes under these categories. And many chronic illnesses bring with it depression, anxiety, stress, which fits into both categories. But there's also what they call the undiagnosed conditions, which come from just having symptoms that they never find a label for, or chronic pain, having a car accident that changes the course of your life and you're never quite the same, right? And you're always getting flare-ups. So these are just things to think about. I know it's been mentioned today sometimes, well, I have lupus, but I also have this, and I have symptoms of that. And how do I know if it's this or it's that? And that's part of what you have to deal with. Oops. So that's just some of the stuff that kind of comes with having a chronic illness. And I'm definitely not the medical side like that lovely doctor was this morning who provided such amazing information. But this is really all about being a healthy person and going into a chronic illness, or already having one potentially for a long time, but how to maintain the best you possible at any given time. So I just want to briefly talk about this, because if you do research on the internet or if you talk to people, some people say, well, all chronic illness, it's all because of emotional stuff. Some people say, no, it's all body stuff. Some of the research says it's both. And so I never try to fight any philosophy. People will have their own philosophy. I think it's all about how do I manage where I'm at today with all the tools I have and be the best me. Whichever philosophy I may have. You just don't want to grasp a philosophy that's going to actually hurt you mentally or physically, because some of them will. Because there's some philosophies out there, if you just have all the right emotions and you just have all those positive vibrations, you will be $1 million. Not necessarily always true, and you always end up somehow not quite thinking right, breathing right, whatever it is, and so that leaves you very harsh on yourself when really you may already be doing the best that you can in that moment. Okay? There is a side of emotions to chronic illness. There's basically everything you do brings an emotion with it. If I was to ask any of you to think about something that made you sad, it would bring up a picture. If I asked you to think of something that made you happy, it would bring up a picture. And the same idea, when you think about your life with a chronic illness, it brings up emotions. So having a chronic illness brings up responses. Having flare-ups brings up responses. So it can be really important to deal with the emotional side of a chronic illness. So a chronic illness basically is a condition that's not going to go away. It becomes your best friend, whether you want it or not. It can be symptomatic, it can be in remission, managed, and includes acute episodes. You can have more than one chronic illness, and that can become very frustrating because sometimes you don't know, is this my lupus day? Is it my fibromyalgia day? Is it just me being a lazy day? And sometimes you just have to go with that. With chronic illness, right, your symptoms can come on gradual. You could have had them for a long time and never really pegged it as having a chronic illness. They can come on very suddenly. And then you can get into this search for a diagnosis, and it can feel desperate. And with that sense of desperation, there's all kinds of emotional stuff going on, and how to deal with that, it's so stressful. Do any of you relate to that, how stressful it is to try and get that diagnosis, to try to get those professionals to work with you and find those best resources? It can be really hard, and it can make you feel sicker than you already are, right? So then there's all the fun of treatments and therapies. Which ones are best for me? How do I know? Everything I read on the internet is this or that, but this disagrees with that, and sometimes it's like I just want to bury my head in the sand and stay there. Then you go into maintenance, which is probably the most wonderful time of any illness, when things kind of just hold their course. But then you can go into flare-ups, and then you get sort of another cycle going on, and this can be what you live through. So stages of a chronic illness, according to a specialist, is there's crisis, stagnation, moving forward, integration, relapse and/or crisis, and then self-management. These become important because at any time you can be in any one of these. This is not a flow-through chart, because we can be doing really well, managing really well, and then something else happens that can aggravate our condition and can throw us back into crisis, which means we sort of have to pull on our toolbox again to do our very best. Has anybody seen this before, sort of the grief cycle, right? You know, and just this is a simple model. There's some more complicated model, but the idea is there's stages of grief, right? And believe it or not, with a chronic illness, this is the same thing, because you lose who you are. You lose your life as you knew it. I mean, if you're a marathon runner and you suddenly get a chronic illness, you may not ever be a marathon runner again. So you now have to re-identify. And then this is some of the stuff emotionally you may deal with a chronic illness. I wonder if any of you can relate to any of these at all through your history. And maybe one jumps out more than the other. And maybe there's something you're dealing with right now, you're going, that's me. These slides will be available after if anybody wants them, rather than having to spend an hour reading my thing there. But this is the biggest question we tend to ask. Why? Why did I get my illness? It's all my fault. If only I had. Why me? If only I hadn't smoked. If only I hadn't eaten potato chips. If only I hadn't been born to parents that were this. If only we hadn't lived in that area in Canada that, you know, everybody there tends to get MS. Believe it or not, Lethbridge is known as the MS capital of North America, just as an example. So there's all kinds of things we go through, and this is the hardest question we ever answer, because many times it has no answer. There is no good answer, but it causes extreme emotional pain. But you will ask it. And so sometimes rather than fighting it, it's just accepting, yep, I'm struggling with this today. Acceptance becomes an amazing tool that sometimes we think, well, it should have a backwards effect, but in actuality, embracing sometimes how we feel actually makes it less intense and makes it easier to deal with that emotion and that stress. So much to worry about. This becomes such a big thing because anxiety and stress makes anything you have so much worse. So one of the first things in dealing, whether you're working with a counselor, a doctor, or just doing self-help, is to get the anxiety under control as best you can. And you guys were playing with that just a little while ago. So if you fall asleep because you're relaxed from your yoga, that's okay. I totally understand. So some of the things that you have to contend with, that's you there, or me. And you can see there you've got your family to deal with and all of what that might mean, and depending where you are in the life cycle. With lupus, listening today, I mean, if you want children, that's a huge thing you have to think about, all those risks involved, right? So family support, daily life management, or not support. How many people have had family that just think you just need to pull up your socks and get it together? That's really tough. That's a tremendous amount of judgment, right? Then you have to deal with your doctor, and maybe you have an amazing doctor, and maybe you don't. Or maybe you did and now you don't, right? So you have to deal with referrals and specialists. And I heard people today complaining about, yeah, but I only get to see my rheumatologist once a year. What do I do if I'm in a flare-up and I need to see them? How do I get that? So these are just some of the things you're contending with. And then appointments and tests. I don't know about anybody else in this room, but medical appointments sometimes are incredibly time-consuming. I actually lost a job one time because I had too many tests to go to after I'd had a flare-up of something not even related to my illness, but it was costing me a lot of time, and I got fired. And what do? You still got to take care of you because you are the most important thing in your world, right? Because if you don't look after you, you won't be working anyways, right? So then you've also got therapies and treatments. Which ones are right for you? How do you decide? And it's ongoing. It's what you choose and what works now may not work next month. And this may not sound like it's part of the emotional side of it, but it is, because all of this involves making decisions, thinking, discussions, and then trying to make best choices. And every thought you have has an emotion attached. Every emotion you have has a thought attached. They have behaviors attached, right? Do you ever get really stressed and all you want to do is numb out in front of the TV? Do you do that sometimes? Is it okay? Probably. But you don't want to be doing it every day, all day, right? But as you're dealing with these things, there's so much to think about. What about work? Are you forced to give it up because you have no choice, because your condition is so bad at this time? Can it be modified? How does it affect your income? What if I have to go on welfare? I can't even afford treatment, right? What if I lose it? Can I retrain? Is it possible? Like, so many questions, so many issues. And so this is part of what you're going to be dealing with. So there will be emotions. And if you are dealing with this, you know what I mean. Maybe you've had to deal with some of this, maybe not all of it, because most illnesses are on a continuum, right? Some people have fewer symptoms, some people have more symptoms. And so it's really going to depend where you're at in all of sort of that continuum. And the interesting thing is, there may be a time period where your symptoms are very mild, and then a time period when they're very severe. And so again, this little chart will change over time. So anxiety reduction, because it does affect everything, right? There's certain things you want to do. You want all the tools you can get. Part of that comes in with being sympathetic to yourself. Does anybody here struggle with negative self-talk? Yay, there's at least a couple people. I still can. I try not to, but I still can, right? And that's when we tend to find the biggest shovel we can and beat ourselves. It's like, wow, what is your problem? Yesterday you could do this. Last week you could. Why not today? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a simple answer? So it's getting, though, that understanding of your illness and where you're at in your illness, too. I mean, I bet you in 10 years from now, if you looked back and thought, wow, how I was handling things back then, I would never do that now. And you probably wouldn't, because you have so much more understanding and you've learned, right? So that's why becoming an expert in you and an expert in your illness, so important in dealing with all of this emotional stuff. Knowing all of the options that you have and making the best informed choices really helps you deal with emotional stuff. Hope, as silly as it sounds, it's one of the strongest and most important things we have. Hope in research, hope in the good care that we have, hope in the support that we have, plans that we make, right? Things that I want to do. EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Technique. And you can go on the internet and read about it, and it will tell you that it will cure everything. Don't believe it, please. But there's some lovely research going on in Emotional Freedom Technique. Has anybody heard of Emotional Freedom Technique? I love it. Cool. Okay. It's a technique where it's basically tapping on acupressure points and talking at the same time. There's a huge amount of research going into it now. It's been compared with EMDR, and I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a technique where it's a rapid eye movement that you could only do with a therapist. But EFT its base is as a self-help technique. So it's having some lovely results, and there's lots more research going on. Where it had its original start and where it is now is quite a bit different. But yeah, it's a very interesting technique. And yes, I do use it with clients, and I actually run a weekly group using EFT. So breathing, something you were doing with your yoga class, just things that are self-nurturing, being resilient and building resilience, because we don't realize sometimes being resilient is a skill set. We're not born resilient. We may be born, some people are more positive, more negative, more happy, less happy. Maybe I'm excellent at art, maybe I'm excellent at writing. We do have some natural tendencies, but like anything, resiliency can be built, and it's absolutely worth putting as much money as you can in your resiliency bank account, because when things get into flare up, it will stead you well in managing those rough times. And then forgiving yourself and others, and this doesn't mean that, it's not about, well, you were mean to me, I need to forgive you. This is about forgiving yourself that you have a chronic illness, that this is not a punishment from anybody, that you don't deserve this, because this is something people will struggle with. Is this something anybody has gone through? Having to struggle with, I must deserve this, somehow I've done something, and the idea of karma. And if you haven't, that's beautiful, but this is something we find that this is something people struggle with a lot. And it can actually ruin relationships too, because sometimes a mate or an important family member really can't forgive you for having a chronic illness and ruining their life, because you're not who they married, right? Okay. So toolbox. This is key, and this is a fun thing, because this is where, as somebody with a chronic illness, we get to explore. Whether it's yoga or any other technique that we take up, you want to look at things that work really well. I do like EFT, but exercise is important, what you eat, how you eat. You were learning a little bit about that this morning. These all become the tools that you put in your toolbox. And believe it or not, what you eat affects how you emotionally react. If I decide that Tim Hortons and I are best friends every morning and it's a cup of coffee and 2 donuts, I am not going to be running on all thrusters all day, any day. But I will be running on emotional low battery. So it means I won't be handling my relationships, my physical illness, nor will I be handling even my own emotional reactions very well. The occasional time of having a donut and a coffee is probably not a big deal, but you don't want to make this your everyday, all day, right? And you want to have an emotional first aid kit. And that'll include things like favorite movies, teas, guided imagery candles, hot baths, things that make you comfortable, things that soothe you, right? That's part of that self-nurturing stuff. And please, if anybody has a question, don't hesitate to ask. Ooh, where'd I go? What did I do? Oh, no, I'm back there. Okay. Hope. Okay. Why making hope, having hope is so important, right? Because basically you want to have as much positive mental health and emotional well-being as possible. And it is possible, even with a chronic illness, to have a really spectacular life. It doesn't mean it's pain-free or symptom-free, but it is a life. It's yours. And you get to have the biggest say in it. You may have crappy days. I hate to admit that, but we do. And that's why you want to be realistic, not pessimistic. Half a glass of water is neither half full nor half empty. It's a half a glass of water, right? I mean, that's kind of the realistic approach, right? So there is that middle ground between the super never negative to the completely negative. A half a glass of water is a half a glass of water. If I'm thirsty, it's good. So also making hope about what's important now. Just because you have a chronic illness doesn't mean you can't make plans and you can't do things and you can't have a life. Maybe it's not going to be what you originally planned. Maybe you're going to be looking at what's new for you and what's important for you, right? And it may be different than what you really ever thought, but you still get to make choices and you still get to have choice, right? Has anybody ever heard of keeping track of magic moments? You're supposed to say no, okay? This is supposed to be something I like to think I teach clients. It has to do with gratitude, and it has to do with a little different though. Typical gratitude journaling is, I'm grateful for being alive, I'm grateful for my Uncle Sam, I'm grateful for my dog, and after a few days of doing that, it's like, whatever, I don't care, throw away my gratitude journal. But magic moments is way different. It's really looking at sometimes something that's as short as 3 seconds in a day that was spectacular. An example that always stands out for me is driving to work one day and driving down a street I don't normally drive down and seeing all these amazing lilac bushes. And I happen to love lilac bushes. And on a sunny day driving past them, maybe 10 seconds, I still vividly carry that in my mind. And that's in one of my days of my magic moments journaling. And anytime I feel kind of yuck, I just have to think back to that and I feel way better. And so this is one of the beauties of doing things like keeping track of magic moments, keeping a journal, and then just adding those few little seconds of things that were really important to you today. Did someone smile at you? Did you hear birds sing? Did you get to talk to somebody that you haven't talked to in a long while and it was really important? So it's a very tiny little thing, but it has amazing, amazing results. I've actually seen clients that start doing this that have suicidal thoughts, and in 2 weeks they get turned around. So this is a very powerful component to making hope and keeping a positive mindset. And then what do you love? What do you have a passion for that you can keep or bring back into your life, or a new love that you didn't know you had that you may get introduced to? So having control in your life. Sometimes when doctors tell you to do this, they poke, they prod, they do tests, you lose control. It feels like your life is not yours. My life belongs to my blood test that I have to do every Monday morning. My life belongs to fibromyalgia that keeps me stuck in bed on days. My life belongs to, and so it feels like I have no control in my own world. So the more control you have, the better. It's important that you have a voice and you have choice. And I love how in the packet that you guys got this morning, it talks about that. You know, it even talked about the relationship with your doctor. It should be a partnership, collaborative. You need as much say in your world as possible. This allows you to manage the emotions as well as you possibly can. Because in the end, the person that you will spend the most amount of time with is you. You get up with you go to bed with you drag you around, you have a good time with you. You are your constant companion in your head. So the more control you have in your world where you feel that you have a say is so important. So keep your independence as much as you can, right? Because we do sometimes want to be looked after. Does anybody ever have that? Sometimes they just want someone to make a decision. They just want them to look after them. No? Cool. Thank you, people. Somebody, yes. Because I certainly have been through, and this is a stage, right? I have been through that stage. It's like somebody just make a decision and just take care of me because I'm just tired of doing it. But if you need to do that for a while, that's okay too. But you want to just keep as much control as you can, even in those moments, right? So no, again, this is all about, you'll see that this tends to repeat itself, but there's some very key components to all this about being your own case manager, being a self-manager, having a voice, dealing with your medical team, even though you'd rather just never have to visit a rheumatologist because all they do is preach at you. Wouldn't it be nice if they just talked with you and collaborated with you? So it's sometimes knowing how to talk to them, and that's not always easy because each doctor is different and they have their own philosophies and their own ideas too. So has anybody ever heard of the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program? I know one person has because we had a conversation about it. Has anybody heard of the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program, also known as Better Choices, Better Health? Cool, I love this. Okay, Alberta Health Services has a program in person or online. I'm still involved at this point in the online one. I volunteer some time to mentor and to facilitate that. But it's about the shared experiences that we have with chronic illness. Because we all have to deal with the doctors. We all have to deal with tests. We all have to make decisions about treatment options. We all have to think about the future. We all have to look at work. So it's a 6-week or 6-session module done by online or in person. You get a beautiful, thick, free book, and because it's done by Alberta Health Services, it's at no cost. So I would encourage everybody to Google Better Choices, Better Health, and have a look and see if the program is something that's right for you. You can ask me about it after, and I'm sorry, what's your name? Crystal, thank you. You can ask Crystal about it, who did it and speaks very highly of it.
Yeah, can I say something? Sorry.
Please.
Just say something about it. When my doctor suggested it, I was extremely nervous because it was going to be in a group therapy kind of thing. And I was like, I don't want to tell my story or I don't want to do any of that. But everybody's going through the same thing. And the first session, you didn't talk about you just introduced yourself, but you didn't say what you had. You didn't talk about your story. Yeah. And it made me come back the next day. And then you kind of got to hear a little bit, but they took control of it. And it was, some people were all at different levels of their illness, and some are at stage 1 where they're angry, mad, why me? Yeah. And others are like, I was there, and it was wonderful. Yeah. So I highly recommend it. It is very
modular. It's very program based. So it's not so much about. It's not like group therapy. It's very much program based. So it's very educational, and it's very about helping you just get as much information as possible. And a lot of what you learn and the suggestions that you get are from other participants that are also walking that road of having the best life possible with a chronic illness. So, yeah. So life rebuilding. Yes, this is what happens, because it can be like one day I was Debra and the next day I was fibromyalgia. And it feels like that's who you are sometimes. Hi, I'm arthritis. I'm diabetes. I'm lupus. Where are you in the mix, right? Because that's what it feels like sometimes. I am my disease. But it's almost like we need to get it out there. That's my disease, right? This is me. I am still here. So you have to rebuild your life, but you want to do it as soon as possible, because it's like, well, maybe when I get a diagnosis, maybe when I get through this flare-up, well, maybe will be forever. If this is your chronic illness and this is now your partner for life, never mind your marriage mate or your kids, this is going to be your closest companion, you need to take back and rebuild your life immediately to whatever level you can, knowing that you have to flex it, right? Because it's going to change through the stages. As Crystal was mentioning, those early stages we're often totally confused, upset, have no idea what's going on. I've just been robbed. My whole life just got stolen from me. I'm now a victim of whatever disease, and I may not even know what it is. I'm a victim of symptoms, and nobody ever talked to me about this. Nobody ever asked me, right? So it's important to recognize that this is going to be part of that, especially the early stages journeys, and none of you may be in the early stages in that sense. You may have a better balance in your world. But when you have a flare-up, you have to think about how to manage that flare-up. And even the idea of role redesign and integration, because you may not be the same person at work. I may not be able to clean the house. You have no idea how hard it was when I had to say no about cleaning my house to the extent that I used to. I have learned to become okay with untidy, and I never thought I would. It's life, right? Like there's only so many things I can manage, and as you get more things on your plate, if you're a parent, if you're working, if you're looking after older parents, then some things have to give, and the one thing that can't give is taking care of you. You have to be looked after. You have to be well cared for. And the person that pushes for that the most will be you, right? And even your relationships will change. Unfortunately, they do. Because again, that example of a marathon runner, if you've been a marathon runner, you may not be that anymore. But does that mean you have to give up things that you love? Maybe you can go for long walks. And you guys may have to tag me on time. I realize that. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so, but yeah, you may have to recognize that you're not going to be that same person, okay? So how do you manage pain and symptoms? Clearly you keep track of working with your doctors, your medical team, and your therapist. If the emotional stuff gets bigger than what you can manage, is there a reason to see a counselor? Absolutely. Or seek out a support group, you better believe it. And so you want to get as many tools as you can, right? For this kind of stuff. So deep breathing, relaxation, laughter, distraction, things that you invent that, wow, that it works for you, right? Heck, I even do popcorn therapy every once in a while. A movie and popcorn sometimes is a perfect distraction. It's just what I need, and then I'm ready to roll again once I've kind of gotten out of my own head, right? Yes, my relaxed cat. Okay, so how do you keep your emotional balance? Again, you'll notice that some of these points are getting repeated, right? You need to understand what's going on in your world. You need to understand your own illness and that it isn't always the same, right? And that you have to be flexible. The most important thing you'll ever do now is become a rubber band. You will have to learn to be flexible. If you were inflexible before, please become flexible now. Because things change, right? And you may find that you have to learn to let go of old things, embrace new things, maybe even rediscover things. Maybe, when I was in high school, I used to write. It was wonderful. I had a great time with it, but gave it up because I got into sports. Now I have a chronic illness, I haven't written in a long time. Maybe it's something I'll take up again. So these are things that you might want to start bringing back into your world. Journaling is very powerful as an example. Journaling, they're finding, based on recent studies, when you journal, it actually has a positive effect on your immune system. People that journal on a regular basis seem to get less colds and flus, which is interesting, and this is in some of the reading you'll do on the Alberta Health Services website. So it's kind of an interesting stat. Who'd have thought writing about your problems could improve your immune system? Go figure, eh? And so getting help, getting support, days like this are your support, right? Websites, Facebook can be your support, appropriately used, of course. And all the self-help techniques that you can find, right? Because really, again, this gets back to who do you spend the most amount of time with? Yourself. I hope you're good company. So your support system is going to be your doctors, specialists, whoever they might be, part of your healthcare team. You might have parts of your healthcare team might be your physiotherapist, whom you don't see all the time, but you see occasionally. You might work out at a gym, and that becomes part of your healthcare team. So the healthcare team doesn't necessarily mean your doctor. Just your doctor. It can be all kinds of people that fit into your world that make sense and help you be the best you possible, right? So think of it that way. You may have to be looking at friendships that don't work anymore because these friends only want to run that marathon and they're just not interested in being friends unless you're out running, and it just doesn't work for you anymore. So you may have to be letting go of some friendships. Not that you don't like the people, but it just doesn't work in your world anymore. So these are some of the things that you have to change. Looking for community resources like the Lupus Society, right? And other things that give you supports, right? Support groups, local and online. There are specific support groups often for many conditions. And there's actually some Facebook groups that are related to certain conditions, national, international. And so you can get those connections and it can actually be really helpful. Our library here totally blows me away. You name the subject, you can probably find a book on it. So it's an amazing resource. And has anyone ever heard of the primary care networks? The primary care networks, which you have to generally be referred to by your doctor, but they have groups that go on depression and anxiety. Places like Momentum Walk-In Counseling has a depression and anxiety group as an example. And you may think, well, yeah, but I have lupus. Yes, but sometimes you may be dealing with depression and anxiety. But they have a group that meets twice a month that's supported by the Wellness Network, which is free for people to attend. So there's really a lot of resources that you may not even think about, whether it's Edmonton or Calgary or other parts of Alberta. So learning about them is really powerful, right? And yeah, there may be times when you're going to see a counselor. You may not want to do Freudian psychoanalytical stuff, but if your anxiety is out of control, you may want to talk about it. You may want a safe place sometimes to say, I hate my illness, which means I hate myself. Do you really hate yourself? No, but you may hate the stage you're in. And sometimes getting support for that's really important, and it's okay. It doesn't mean you're weak or bad or anything. It just means that you're reaching out and using your support system. Besides, if people didn't do that, people like me wouldn't have a job. So bottom line is it's all about self-management, right? Everything you do is going to be about you being the case manager, right? I love the phrase, in this moment, because whatever's going on in your world today, it's in this moment. What happened yesterday is not what's happening today. What's happening tomorrow is not what's happening in this moment. The more we can stay in this moment, it doesn't mean we don't plan for the future. It doesn't mean we don't pine for the past. But the more we can recognize, especially when we're struggling with negative and destructive emotions, The more we can realize I'm in this moment, the easier it is to focus and deal with it sometimes. And there we go again. See, that own best friend, getting your toolbox, establishing goals, and meeting them realistically, right? If all you have is half a glass of water, that's what you got. The point is, it's not completely dry, right? So it's being that realistic, right? Really knowing what you have and where you're at and dealing with it realistically. But again, always positive, because this may be way better than it was last week, or next week's going to be better. I just want to give you a bit of a case example. This is a lady named Rachel. She's in her early 20s, and no, she doesn't have lupus, because I don't have a patient right now with lupus or a client with lupus that I can use. But she has a chronic illness that involves her brain. She actually has lesions on her brains. It affects her body, her heart, and other body symptoms. It's actually not fun for sure, but she actually functions quite well. But she spends way too much time in emergency. Every time she has a slight, any kind of physical symptom, she runs to emergency. It's costing the system a lot, and she's spending a lot of time there. She also has very poor lifestyle habits in how she eats. She doesn't sleep well. So she's not making some really good choices, and she doesn't have a strong emotional support system. So if someone like Rachel came to see me, what would we do? What would we hope to do? What we might hope to do is reduce her visits to emergency so that she gets that under control, so better symptom management, right? Build a better emotional support system, desire to live a healthier lifestyle, so to start making some of those better choices, become a better self-manager, more empowerment, coping skills, and then more self-nurturing, right? These are the things that we would want to hopefully help her move toward. And how might we do this? From Australia, there's something called the Centre for Clinical Interventions, and they have a number of self-help modules, which are CBT based, which is cognitive behavior therapy, which affects, it's the idea of your emotions and your feelings. And so work with her through the ones that are on health anxiety and self-esteem. She's in emergency because of health anxiety, right? So learning to be uncomfortable even with her symptoms, but being okay with that. Some psychoeducational handouts on some of the stuff she's going through, some discussions about lifestyle habits and choices so that she can do better, helping her to do better self-monitoring about how she's feeling and what's going on so that she understands it better and that she can have better communication with her doctor, right? Building in some better coping strategies in what she has, working on some self-nurturing techniques, whether it's deep breathing or exercise or other things that help her feel better about herself. Better communication skills for how she actually deals with her healthcare team so that she can feel better supported. In her case, we used emotional freedom technique because it helped with some of the emotional stuff she was going through. And then some confidence building that she could manage her condition and she could work with herself, with her healthcare team. And we were able to see some really nice results with her. It wasn't an instant fix, nothing ever is. But the idea is, so even if we're struggling over here emotionally, with a number of strategies, we can bring ourselves to a place where we're feeling much more balanced and doing much better. Sometimes with the help of a counselor, sometimes with the help of our doctor, sometimes just with the help of a self-help book or the help of a friend, right? So honestly, I think half the world's problems, including our issues with war and peace, would be solved if we spent more time at Starbucks. So anyways, I hope some of this has been helpful. That's it from me. Thank you for listening. Any questions at all? Yes?
Debra, can you talk a little bit about learning to say no? Something we have to deal with.
Yes, the idea of, yeah, and that's the hardest thing we do, isn't it? And you know who the first person you have to say no to is? Yourself, yeah. And that's the hardest boundary to set because you want to do it. I want to do everything, right? Like I say, the hardest thing I ever learned to do was to live with my house untidy at times. Turns out I didn't die from an untidy house. Neither did my kids. They're both grown up and they're still alive. So there's hope that an untidy house doesn't kill your kids. But yeah, it's hard to do, and it starts with becoming an advocate for yourself. That it's actually okay to say no, and that it's not you shirking responsibility if you say no to things. And so yeah, it's, you know how you actually learn to do it is by practice. Every time a situation comes up, making those decisions in your head, is this a yes or a no situation? And deciding what the best response for you is in that moment. And then giving yourself permission to say no and not feel guilty. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Useful? Okay.